The sun was hanging low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. The air shimmered with heat and the earth smelled of dust and dry grass. A cowboy named Eli Turner rode slowly across the open land. His brown horse Dusty moved with tired steps, its hooves kicking up clouds of sand. Eli had been traveling for days without real rest. His water was running low and he hadn't seen another person for nearly 2 days. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, and he wasn't sure if he was going the right way anymore. Eli was a quiet man, not the kind who talked much. He worked with cattle, helped ranch owners, and moved from place to place looking for small jobs. He had grown up around the sound of whistling wind, creaking saddles, and the steady rhythm of hooves. He was used to being alone, but that day, as the sun began to burn his neck and his lips turned dry, even loneliness began to feel heavy. He pulled out a small piece of jerky from his saddlebag, chewed slowly and patted his horse's neck. "Just a little further, boy," he said softly. "We'll find water soon." His voice cracked slightly from the dry air. Not long after, he saw something in the distance, a faint line of smoke rising from behind a ridge. His heart lifted. Smoke meant people, and where there were people, there was water. He kicked his heels gently against Dusty's sides, guiding the horse toward the smoke. As he drew closer, Eli noticed small huts made from wood and hides, with tall poles standing around them. It was an Apache village. He knew he was deep in their territory now. He hesitated, his heart beating faster. Stories had spread among cowboys about how fiercely the Apache guarded their lands. Eli had no wish to cause trouble. He just needed water and a place to rest. He stopped his horse at the edge of the camp, keeping his hands visible and calm. The sound of drums and soft laughter reached his ears. Children ran between the huts, women carried baskets, and men worked on tools and arrows. The whole place felt alive. For a moment, Eli just watched quietly, feeling both nervous and curious. That was when 3 young Apache women noticed him. They were sitting near a small fire, weaving baskets and chatting softly. One of them saw the tall, dusty stranger and whispered something to the others. Soon all 3 were looking at him. Their dark eyes sparkled with curiosity, and then they began to giggle. Eli felt his face grow warm. He wasn't used to being laughed at, especially by strangers. He tried to sit straighter on his horse and tipped his hat politely. "Howdy," he said, his voice dry and awkward. The women exchanged amused glances. One of them, bold and lively, repeated the word howdy in a playful tone, imitating him perfectly. The others laughed even harder. He scratched his head and smiled nervously. I don't mean any harm," he said slowly, hoping they could understand. "Just need some water." He pointed toward his water flask, then toward the nearby stream. The women didn't seem to understand all his words, but they understood his gesture. One of them stood up, a woman named Nalin. She was taller than the others, with long black hair tied with beads and feathers. Her eyes were sharp but not unkind. She said something in her own language that Eli couldn't follow, but her tone sounded teasing. She pointed at his hat, then at his boots, saying something that made the other 2 laugh again. Eli could guess she was making fun of how he looked, dusty, awkward, and completely out of place. He sighed and gave a small smile. "Yeah, I know," he muttered under his breath. "I look like trouble." When Nalin saw that he wasn't angry, her laughter softened. She said something else, this time more curious than teasing, and gestured for him to follow. Eli climbed off his horse, careful to move slowly. He didn't want to startle anyone. She led him to a wooden bucket filled with clear water near a small shelter. He knelt down and filled his flask, then gave his horse a drink too. The 3 women watched closely. They whispered among themselves, sometimes laughing again when Eli stumbled over small things, like when he tried to say thank you in their language and completely mispronounced it. He pointed at himself and said, "Eli," tapping his chest. The women exchanged glances. Nalin repeated softly, "Eli," testing the sound. The way she said it made his name sound like part of a song. He smiled. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows to ask her name. She hesitated, then finally said, "Nalin." Eli nodded. "Nalin," he repeated carefully, trying not to sound foolish. She smiled faintly, clearly amused, but not unkind. It was a strange and quiet exchange, half laughter, half curiosity. None of them understood much of what the other said, but somehow, they communicated through gestures and expressions. Eli found himself relaxing a little. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of company. But as more people in the camp began to notice the stranger, the mood started to shift. A few of the Apache men stopped their work to watch him. Their eyes were serious, their posture alert. Eli could sense the change instantly. He stood up straight, pulled down his hat, and stepped back slowly toward his horse. The women noticed too. Their laughter faded. Nalin looked over her shoulder at the men approaching. One of them spoke quickly in their language, his voice firm. The three women fell silent. Eli tried to speak again. "I'm not staying," he said gently. "Just needed a little water." He pointed toward his horse again, hoping they'd understand he planned to leave soon. Before he could mount, a deep voice called out. The crowd parted as Chief Taza, the leader of the camp, stepped forward. His presence was strong, his eyes calm but commanding. He looked at Eli for a long moment, saying nothing. The air grew still, even the children stopped playing. Eli didn't move. He waited, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. Finally, the chief spoke in his language, and one of the older men translated in rough English. "You come from far," the man said. "You walk in our home without asking. Why?" Eli swallowed and tried to keep his voice steady. "I didn't mean to trespass," he said. "My horse needed water. I'll leave now." The interpreter repeated his words to the chief, who nodded slowly but didn't speak. His gaze moved to the three women, Nalin and her friends. They stood nervously, their laughter now gone completely. The chief said something to them, and they lowered their heads. Eli didn't know what was being said, but he could tell it wasn't good. His heart started to pound again. He wanted to explain more, but the words wouldn't come. He felt trapped between fear and confusion. Then something unexpected happened. The chief's tone softened slightly. He walked closer to Eli, studying him carefully. Eli met his eyes and saw not anger, but thoughtfulness. After a few moments, the chief spoke again through the interpreter. "You are not like other white men," the interpreter said slowly. "You did not draw your weapon. You did not shout. You respect our people." "This is good," Eli nodded, relieved. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The chief continued speaking, his words long and deliberate. When the interpreter finished, Eli felt his breath catch in surprise. "The chief says you will stay until he decides what is right," the man said. "You will not be harmed, but you will not leave until he says so." Eli glanced around the camp. The faces that once smiled now looked cautious and curious. The three women stood off to the side, whispering again, their earlier laughter now mixed with worry. Nalin's eyes met his for a moment. She looked uncertain, almost sorry. That evening, as the sun sank behind the red cliffs, the camp grew quiet. Fires burned low, and the sound of drums echoed faintly in the distance. Eli sat near his horse, watching the stars appear one by one. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what the chief would decide, but he couldn't stop thinking about the laughter he'd heard earlier that day. It had been light and full of life, and for a brief moment it had made him forget the loneliness of the road. He wondered if he would hear that laughter again, or if the day's events had silenced it forever. Little did Eli know, that laughter would soon return, but in a way that would change his life and Nalin's forever. The morning sun rose gently over the red hills, spreading golden light across the Apache camp. The wind carried the soft smell of smoke from cooking fires, and the quiet sounds of daily life began to fill the air. Children laughing, women preparing breakfast, and horses neighing in the distance. But for Eli Turner, the cowboy who had wandered into their world, the day felt heavy with uncertainty. He sat beside his horse, watching the people move around. Nobody spoke to him directly, but no one chased him away either. He could feel curious eyes on him from every direction. Every now and then, someone would glance at him and whisper something he couldn't understand. He felt like a stranger in a story that didn't belong to him. Eli took a sip from his canteen, now full of fresh water from their stream, and tried to think. He didn't mean to stay. He didn't mean to cause any trouble. But the chief, Taza, had spoken the night before, saying Eli would remain in the camp until a decision was made. A decision about what, Eli didn't yet know. As he sat lost in thought, he saw Nalin approaching. She was the same woman who had laughed at him yesterday, the one with the quiet confidence in her step and the spark in her eyes. This time she wasn't laughing. She carried a small wooden bowl filled with something that smelled warm and earthy. When she reached him, she said a few words in her language and gestured for him to take it. Eli hesitated. "Is that for me?" he asked gently. She nodded, holding it out again. He accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you," he said. Then as she turned to go, he pointed at the bowl and asked, "What is this?" She paused, thinking for a moment, then said slowly, "Ate, corn, stew." The words were careful but kind. Her English wasn't perfect, but it was enough for him to understand. Eli nodded gratefully and said her name softly, "Nalin." She looked at him briefly, then smiled and walked away. The food warmed him more than he expected. It wasn't just the heat of the stew. It was the quiet kindness behind it. He felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the camp saw him as an enemy. Later that morning, 2 young men came to him and motioned for him to follow. Their faces were serious but not threatening. Eli stood up, brushed the dust from his clothes, and followed them through the camp toward a large open area near the center. There, sitting cross-legged beside a fire, was Chief Taza. The chief was a man of great presence. His hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes were sharp yet calm like still water. Around him stood several elders, and behind them a small circle of villagers had gathered. Among them, Eli saw Nalin and the other 2 women who had laughed with her the day before. Eli felt his throat tighten. He removed his hat out of respect and waited. The chief began to speak in Apache, his voice steady and commanding. One of the older men translated for Eli in slow, careful English. "Stranger," the man said, "you came into our land without asking. You entered our camp. You talked to our women. Do you know this is not our way?" Eli nodded quickly, trying to show respect. "I understand," he said. "I meant no harm. I didn't know I was this far into your land. I was lost and only needed water." The translator spoke his words to the chief, who listened in silence. The fire crackled softly between them. After a long pause, the chief said more words in Apache. The translator continued, "The chief says, many men like you have come before. They took from the land. They took from the people. They said they meant no harm, but they did not keep their word." Eli felt his heart sink. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, things he had never done but was still being judged for. He looked down at the ground and said quietly, "I'm not like them. I swear it. I just wanted to find a safe path." The translator repeated his words. The chief's face softened slightly, but he still looked thoughtful, as if trying to see into Eli's soul. Then the chief spoke again, this time longer. His words carried emotion, firm yet filled with wisdom. The translator's voice wavered slightly as he translated. The chief says, he believes every person has a spirit that tells truth better than words. He watched you yesterday. You did not lift your hand. You did not show anger when the women laughed. That tells him something about your heart. Eli looked up, surprised. He believes me? The translator nodded slowly. He believes you are not here to harm, but still, the rules of our people must be honored. The women broke custom by speaking and laughing with a stranger. The chief must make balance. Eli's confusion deepened. Balance? The translator hesitated, then said, "He will decide what must be done, for them, for you, for all." A murmur went through the crowd. Nalin lowered her eyes, her face serious now. The laughter of yesterday was gone completely. Eli wanted to speak, to explain that it wasn't their fault, but he stayed quiet, afraid he might say the wrong thing. The chief stood up slowly and walked around the fire. His steps were deliberate. When he stopped in front of Eli, the camp fell silent. The chief placed a hand on Eli's shoulder and said something softly in Apache. The translator took a deep breath and said, "The chief says maybe this happened for a reason. Maybe the spirits wanted you here." Eli blinked, unsure if he had heard right. "A reason?" The translator nodded. "He says that sometimes laughter is not an accident, it is the beginning of a path." The chief turned and spoke again, his tone firmer now. The translator continued, "To make peace between our people and your kind, the chief says one of the women will join with you in marriage. This will be your bond of trust." For a moment, Eli thought he misunderstood. "Marriage?" he repeated, stunned. "I don't understand." "I never asked," the crowd began to whisper. The women who had laughed yesterday covered their mouths in surprise. Nalin's eyes widened. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed it to her chest. Eli felt frozen, unsure what to say or do. The translator spoke again. "The chief says this is not punishment. This is a gift, 2 worlds meeting in peace. The woman chosen will be Nalin, daughter of Morning Wind. She is strong and she will teach you our ways. Nalin looked at her father, the chief, in disbelief. "Father," she said softly in her language, but he raised his hand gently to stop her. His expression was kind but final. The decision had been made. Eli's heart raced.
He didn't know what to feel.
Part of him wanted to protest, to say that marriage was too great a step for strangers. But another part of him saw the calm in the chief's eyes, the way the people trusted him completely. This was not a punishment for them. It was a way of building peace. "I don't want to disrespect your people," Eli said carefully, "but she doesn't even know me." "I don't even know her," the translator repeated his words. The chief listened and then replied with a faint smile. "The chief says," the translator explained, "knowing comes after time, not before it. If your heart is true, peace will grow. If not, the wind will carry you away." It was poetic, mysterious, and heavy all at once. Eli didn't fully understand, but he could feel the weight of what was happening. The crowd began to disperse slowly, whispering about the strange cowboy and the chief's choice. Some smiled, others looked doubtful. Nalin stayed where she was, quiet and still. Her eyes met Eli's for a brief moment. There was no laughter now, only uncertainty. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that their lives had just changed forever. As the day went on, preparations began quietly around the camp. Women gathered cloths and beads. The elders spoke in hushed tones. Eli sat under a shade tree, lost in thought. He had come looking only for water, and somehow fate had tied him to a people and a woman he barely knew. That evening, Nalin passed by him again, carrying a bundle of herbs. She didn't look at him directly, but when she did, it was only for a second. A glance filled with questions neither of them could answer yet. Eli sighed softly, watching the desert sky turn orange and purple. "What have I gotten myself into, Dusty?" he whispered to his horse. The animal flicked its ear and snorted quietly, as if it didn't know either. The stars began to appear one by one, glowing above the dark desert. In the heart of the Apache village, two lives that had once been strangers were now bound by the will of a wise chief, and by a destiny neither of them had chosen. And somewhere in the stillness of the night, faint and distant, the sound of laughter echoed again, soft, uncertain but alive. It was the laughter of beginnings, not endings. The desert morning came quietly, with soft colors brushing the sky, orange, pink, and gold melting into each other like watercolor. But inside the Apache camp, something heavy filled the air. People whispered as they walked past, glancing at the stranger, the cowboy who had come from nowhere and was now to marry one of their own. Eli Turner sat by the fire, turning his hat in his hands again and again. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts kept circling the same questions. How could this happen? How could a few minutes of laughter turn into something so serious? He looked toward the women's area of the camp, but quickly looked away again. He didn't want to make things harder than they already were. On the other side of the camp, Nalin sat beside her mother, her face calm but her eyes far away. Her mother spoke softly, brushing Nalin's long black hair, but Nalin barely heard her words. Her heart was full of mixed feelings, confusion, pride, and something close to fear. She had laughed at the cowboy once, but she never imagined she would be told to marry him. She respected her father, the chief, and knew his word was law, yet her mind was full of questions she couldn't ask out loud. As the sun climbed higher, the chief's decision began to take form. The elders gathered, and women began preparing simple gifts, blankets, beads, and food for the union. It wasn't a wedding like the ones Eli had seen before, with music and dancing. This was quieter, more spiritual. It was about peace and balance, not celebration. When the time came, Eli stood before the chief, wearing the cleanest shirt he owned. He looked nervous but respectful. The people gathered around, forming a wide circle. Nalin stepped forward, dressed in a soft brown dress decorated with turquoise beads. Her hair shone under the sunlight, and though her face showed calmness, her hands trembled slightly. The chief spoke in his deep, steady voice, his words flowing in Apache. The translator explained to Eli in soft English, "The chief says two paths meet today. One from the east wind, one from the west. Together they must learn to walk the same ground." Eli nodded slowly, trying to understand the meaning. He looked at Nalin, but she kept her eyes on the ground. Then, the chief tied a small piece of red cloth around both their wrists, symbolizing unity. The cloth was light, but Eli could feel the weight of what it meant. When the chief finished speaking, the people bowed their heads and the circle slowly broke apart. There was no cheering or clapping, only quiet acceptance, and just like that they were married. After the ceremony, Nalin walked away without a word. Eli didn't try to stop her. He didn't know what to say. He sat near his horse, Dusty, trying to let the reality settle in. He was married to a woman who didn't know him, who hadn't chosen him. And yet somehow he felt that their lives were now bound in a way neither of them could undo. That evening, the chief invited Eli to his fire. Nalin sat beside her father, quiet as a shadow. The translator helped them talk. The chief spoke gently, explaining that Eli would stay in the camp as part of their family. He would learn their ways, help with the horses, and build trust. If you work with your hands and your heart, the translator said, you will earn respect. Eli nodded. I'll do my best, he replied. When they finished eating, Eli thanked them and left. Nalin stayed behind, talking softly with her mother. As he walked past, their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in her gaze, only distance like the quiet between two storms. The days that followed were not easy. Eli tried to fit into the rhythm of the Apache camp, but every task was new to him. He helped fetch water, chop wood, and take care of the horses. Some of the men watched him closely, testing his patience with small challenges. An extra load to carry, a quiet stare meant to remind him that he didn't belong. But Eli never argued. He kept working quietly, respectfully. Nalin, meanwhile, watched him from a distance. At first she thought he was clumsy, too slow, too unsure. But she also noticed something else. He never complained. Even when his hands blistered, even when he didn't understand a word of what others said, he just kept trying. One afternoon, Eli saw Nalin struggling to lift a heavy pot near the fire. Without thinking, he rushed over to help. She frowned at first, embarrassed that she needed help, but he only smiled and said, "Let me." She didn't understand his words, but his tone was gentle. Together they moved the pot, and for the first time she looked at him without distance in her eyes. "Thank you," she said in careful English. Eli grinned. "You're welcome." He pointed at the pot. "Heavy," he added, pretending to struggle again. Nalin laughed softly despite herself. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh since the day they met. That small moment became a turning point. Slowly they began to find ways to communicate. Eli learned a few Apache words: water, fire, horse, thank you. Nalin corrected him when he said them wrong, sometimes teasing him gently. He taught her some English words too, like sun, friend, and peace. Their words were broken, but their laughter bridged the gaps. At night, Eli would sit outside his small shelter looking up at the stars. The desert sky stretched endlessly above him, and for the first time in his life he didn't feel completely alone. Nalin often sat a little distance away, weaving baskets under the same starlight. They didn't always talk, but the silence between them started to feel comfortable, not strange. Weeks passed. The people in the camp began to see that Eli was not a troublemaker. He fixed saddles, mended fences, and even helped the children learn how to ride gently instead of rough. His patience surprised many. The chief watched quietly and said little, but Eli could sense that he was being measured every day. One morning, Nalin brought him a piece of bread she had made. "Try," she said, handing it to him shyly. It was still warm. He took a bite and smiled. "Good," he said. "Very good," she laughed softly. "You lie," she said, shaking her head. He laughed too, admitting, a little. "But it's better than I could do." That small exchange made the air between them lighter. Over time, they began to work together more often, carrying water, tending the horses, and sharing simple meals. It wasn't love yet, but it was respect, slowly growing like a small plant in dry soil. Sometimes Eli would catch her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. Other times he would glance her way and find her smiling faintly, then quickly turning away. They were two people from different worlds, bound by fate, learning little by little that peace could exist even in the most unexpected places. One night, as the wind whispered softly through the desert grass, Nalin spoke quietly beside the fire. "Why you come here?" she asked, her English slow but careful. Eli looked into the flames before answering. "I was lost," he said. "Looking for a place to rest," she nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" He smiled a little. "Still lost," he said honestly. "But maybe not alone anymore." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The stars shone above them like silver dust, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called softly. In that quiet moment, something inside both their hearts shifted, something small but real. They were no longer just strangers forced together. They were two souls learning to understand one another. The laughter that once separated them had now turned into the bridge that connected them. It was softer, slower, and filled with warmth instead of mockery. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew that the path they were walking, uncertain, fragile and unexpected, was slowly becoming their own. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks quietly became months. The dry winds softened, and the desert slowly changed color as spring came to the Arizona lands. Tiny wildflowers pushed up through the red sand, and the air smelled faintly of sage and rain. Life in the Apache camp moved in rhythm with the season. Eli Turner had learned much since the day he had wandered in, dusty and alone. He could now understand a few more Apache words. He could ride without making the horses nervous, and he could carry out chores without being told twice. Some of the men who once distrusted him now nodded in greeting when he passed. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was respect. A quiet kind that didn't need many words. But even with all his progress, there were still days when Eli felt like a shadow in a world not his own. The customs, the laughter, the prayers by the fire, all of it reminded him that he was still an outsider, living inside a story that had started long before he came. Nalin, too, was changing. At first, she had seen Eli as a stranger forced into her life, a man she had been told to marry against her choice. But as she watched him each day, working with patience, helping the elders, and never raising his voice, she began to feel something she hadn't expected. She found herself smiling when he tried to speak her language and mixed up the words. She found herself listening when he talked softly about his home, about the rivers and hills of Texas. She even began to miss him when he was gone too long with the horses. Still, she didn't admit those feelings to herself. She was proud, strong, and independent. Love, if it ever came, would have to come slowly, like the sunrise that touched the desert 1 inch at a time. One morning, the chief asked Eli to ride out with 2 young Apache men to check the far grazing fields. The horses had wandered near the foothills, and the men needed help bringing them back. Eli agreed gladly. He had grown fond of the land and the animals. Before leaving, he went to say goodbye to Nalin. She was by the river washing clothes. The morning light danced across the water, and her long hair shimmered like black silk. "I'll be gone a day or 2, he said softly. She looked up, her hand still in the water. "You go far?" "Just near the hills," he replied. "We'll bring the horses back." She nodded slowly, pretending to focus on her work, but her eyes softened. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli smiled. "Always." He rode away with the 2 men, the wind carrying the scent of pine and dust. Nalin watched until they disappeared into the horizon, her heart unexpectedly heavy. That evening, dark clouds gathered over the land. The wind picked up and lightning flashed far away in the mountains. The camp grew quiet as people secured their homes and tied down loose things. The sky opened with rain, heavy and cold. Nalin stood at the doorway of her shelter, watching the storm, her thoughts with Eli. She tried to tell herself that he was fine, that he was used to storms, but worry crept into her chest like a whisper she couldn't ignore. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning. When Eli and the others finally returned, their horses were soaked and their clothes clung to their bodies. But Eli's face was calm. He waved when he saw Nalin waiting by the edge of the camp. "You came back," she said softly, relief in her tone. "I told you I would," he replied with a grin, shaking water from his hat. "You worried?" She crossed her arms and smiled shyly. "Maybe a little," he chuckled. "Good to know someone does." That small moment, simple and sweet, stayed in both their hearts. As the days passed, their bond deepened. They shared more words, more quiet glances, more moments that didn't need speaking. Eli learned that Nalin loved the sound of the flute at night, and that she could braid horsehair into beautiful ropes. Nalin learned that Eli missed the smell of rain on Texas grass and that he sometimes dreamed of his mother's voice calling him home. But peace, as gentle as it was, had its shadows. Some in the camp still didn't accept the union. A few whispered that Nalin deserved someone from her own people. Others said the spirits wouldn't bless a bond between an Apache woman and a cowboy. Nalin heard these whispers but kept them to herself. She didn't want to trouble Eli, who was already trying so hard to belong. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the stream, Nalin overheard two young women speaking. "The chief's daughter lives with a white man," one said quietly. "She laughs with him, eats with him, but can he ever understand her heart?" The word stung. Nalin pretended not to hear, but a small ache settled inside her. That night she sat by the fire, quiet and distant. Eli noticed right away. "You're quiet," he said softly. She looked into the flames and said, "People talk." "About me?" She nodded. "They say, we are different. Too different." Eli sighed, staring at the firelight flickering across her face. "Maybe they're right," he said after a moment. "We are different, but that doesn't mean we can't walk the same road." She looked up at him, her eyes deep and searching. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said simply. "You and me, we didn't choose this, but maybe it was meant for something good." Nalin didn't reply right away, but her expression softened. "Maybe," she whispered, and for the first time she reached out her hand and placed it gently over his. It was a small gesture, but to Eli it felt like the world had opened just a little wider. A few weeks later, a group of travelers passed near the Apache lands, settlers moving their wagons across the open desert. They stopped for rest near the hills not far from the grazing fields. Eli recognized one of them from a town he had once worked in. The man waved when he saw him the next morning. "Turner, didn't expect to see you here." Eli walked closer, smiling politely. They talked for a while, about the land, the weather, and the long trail ahead. But when Eli mentioned that he was living with the Apache, the man raised an eyebrow. "With them?" he said, surprised. "And married to one of their women?" "Well, I'll be. You sure you belong there, Turner?" Eli's smile faded slightly, but he stayed calm. "It's where I am now," he said simply, "and I'm at peace." The man chuckled and said, "Peace doesn't last long out here, friend." He tipped his hat and rode off. The words stuck in Eli's mind, not because they were harsh, but because they carried a seed of doubt. That night, as he sat beside Nalin, he found himself quiet and thoughtful. She noticed right away. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "Do you ever wonder if we belong in the same place?" She frowned slightly. "You ask that now?" he sighed. "Sometimes I think I don't deserve this life. Your people, your father, you've given me more than I earned." Nalin looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You don't have to earn peace, Eli. You just have to keep it." Her words, so simple yet true, eased the storm inside him. He smiled faintly. "You always say the right thing," she laughed quietly. "Not always." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and purple, Eli joined the men near the horses. He worked quietly, thinking about how far he had come. He realized then that this place, the camp, the people, Nalin, had become home. Not by blood, not by birth, but by heart. Later that night, he returned to the fire where Nalin sat weaving. The stars above were bright and endless. He sat beside her, watching her hands move gently, skillfully. "You know," he said softly, "when I first came here, I thought this place would never feel like home." "And now?" she asked without looking up. "Now," he said, smiling, "I think I never want to leave." Nalin stopped weaving and looked at him. Her eyes glowed softly in the firelight. "Then stay," she said simply. "Stay and walk beside me." Eli reached out and took her hand, their fingers touching gently. The world around them felt still. The crackling fire, the whisper of wind, the song of night birds. The cowboy and the Apache woman, once divided by language, by laughter, by fate, now sat side by side, hearts quietly learning to beat in the same rhythm. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The world beyond their camp was still uncertain, full of change and mystery. But for that night, under the wide desert sky, there was peace, soft, steady, and real. And in that peace, they both found the courage to believe that love, once planted in unlikely soil, could still take root and grow. The desert slowly shifted once more, moving from the soft warmth of spring to the brightness of early summer. The sun rose earlier and stayed longer in the sky, and the wind that once felt cool now carried the scent of warm dust and wildflowers. The Apache camp moved with the rhythm of the season, people waking early, tending the animals, gathering berries, and preparing for the long, dry months ahead. Life for Eli, Turner, and Nyland had settled into a quiet, steady pattern. Their days were full of small, ordinary moments: fetching water, cooking simple meals, feeding the horses, and sharing laughter when one of them said a word wrong in the other's language. What had once been awkward between them was now easy and familiar. Every morning, Eli woke to the sound of Nyland humming softly as she worked near the fire. Sometimes she sang old Apache songs that he didn't understand, but the melody filled the air with peace. He would sit nearby listening quietly, and though he couldn't catch the words, he could feel what they meant: love, strength, and gratitude for life itself. He had changed since he first came to the camp. The restless look in his eyes was gone. His steps were slower now, more grounded. He had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: belonging, and Nyland too had changed. The proud, guarded woman who once refused to even look at him now smiled easily when he teased her or told her stories about his cowboy days. She had come to see his heart, steady, kind, and full of quiet courage. She respected him, and without realizing it, that respect had slowly turned into something deeper. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the red cliffs, the camp gathered for a small feast. The hunters had brought back fresh food, and everyone shared what they had. The air was full of laughter, music, and the soft beat of drums. Nyland sat beside Eli, handing him roasted corn wrapped in leaves. "You eat too slow," she teased. Eli grinned. "I eat careful. You always say I spill too much." She laughed softly. "Maybe you learn." He chuckled and looked around the camp. Children danced near the fire. Elders told stories, their voices weaving through the rhythm of the drums. It was a picture of peace, and for a moment Eli felt like time itself had stopped. He turned to Nyland and said quietly, "This feels like home." She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "It is home," she said. "You made it so." Those simple words sank deep into his heart. As the weeks passed, Eli continued to work beside the Apache men. Together they repaired fences, gathered wood, and cared for the horses. He had become one of them, not by birth but by trust. Even the children, who had once been shy around him, now ran up to greet him when he returned from the fields. They called him Tall Rider, a name that made him smile every time he heard it. But the real change was in how the people saw Nyland. Once, some had whispered that her marriage to a cowboy was strange, even wrong. Now, when they saw her laughing with Eli or walking beside him through the camp, they saw peace instead of difference. The two of them had become a symbol of something rare. Two worlds living side by side, not fighting, not judging, but learning from each other. Even Chief Taza noticed. One afternoon, he called Eli to his fire. The old chief's eyes were softer now than the first day they met. "You have done well, Turner," he said through the interpreter. "When I made the choice, I hoped for peace not just between our people but in hearts. I see it now. You have both learned." Eli bowed his head respectfully. "I've learned more than I ever expected," he said. "Your people have given me a new life." The chief nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then it was meant to be." One evening, a soft wind carried the smell of rain across the desert. It had been many months since Eli first arrived, and he could feel the change not just in the air but in himself. That night, as the storm clouds gathered, he sat with Nyland outside their shelter, watching the lightning flash in the distance. "You remember?" she said. "The day you came here? You looked lost." Eli smiled faintly. "I was. I didn't even know where I was going." "And now?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "Now I know where I belong." For a while they sat in silence, listening to the first drops of rain fall on the earth. It was gentle, steady, just enough to cool the air and bring the scent of life. Nyland closed her eyes and whispered something in her language. Eli asked, "What did you say?" She smiled. "I thanked the spirits for bringing you here." He chuckled softly. "Guess I should thank them too." Their laughter mixed with the sound of the rain, warm and real. As summer deepened, stories began to spread beyond the camp. Travelers passing through told others of a cowboy who lived among the Apache, of a woman who had once laughed at him and then learned to love him. Some called it a legend, others a lesson. But for Eli and Nyland, it was simply life, beautiful in its simplicity, strong in its quietness. There were still challenges, of course. Sometimes Eli missed his old world, the sound of cattle herds, the open plains, the distant towns. Sometimes Nalin struggled to understand his memories, just as he sometimes struggled to understand her traditions. But every time doubt rose between them, they returned to the same truth. They had found each other for a reason. One day, Eli built a small corral near the edge of the camp, where he trained horses with gentle hands. Nalin often joined him, standing by the fence watching with pride. "You have a gift," she told him one afternoon. He smiled. "Maybe I just have patience," she laughed softly. "Patience is a gift too." When he finished, he handed her the rope and said, "Your turn." She looked unsure but took it. The horse snorted and moved, but Eli placed his hand over hers, steadying her. "Slow," he said softly. "Talk to him. He'll listen." She did, her voice calm and low, and the horse quieted. She looked at Eli with surprise, and he smiled. "See, he trusts you." That simple moment said more than words ever could. It wasn't just the horse learning to trust, it was them, still learning to trust each other every day. That night, as they sat beneath the stars, Nalin leaned her head gently on Eli's shoulder. The sky stretched wide above them, filled with light. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "what if the chief had not said those words that day?" Eli thought for a moment and then said, "Then maybe I'd still be wandering out there, chasing something I couldn't find. Maybe I'd never have known what home really feels like." Nalin smiled, her voice tender. "And I'd still be laughing at strangers." Eli chuckled quietly. "Guess it's good you did." The two of them sat there for a long time, wrapped in silence and starlight. In the distance, a coyote called softly, and the wind moved through the tall grass like a whisper. Everything felt still and eternal. Years later, people would still talk about the cowboy who came to the Apache lands and the woman who laughed at him. They would tell the story to children by the fire, saying, "Sometimes laughter is the beginning of love. And sometimes two hearts can build a bridge stronger than fear." Eli and Nalin never thought of themselves as heroes or legends. They simply lived, with kindness, patience, and faith. Their home remained by the red cliffs, surrounded by the sound of the wind and the warmth of the earth. Each morning, Nalin still sang by the fire, and Eli still greeted the sunrise with quiet gratitude. Their lives were not perfect, but they were peaceful. And that peace, born from laughter and courage, was more beautiful than either of them had ever dreamed. And so, the story of the cowboy and the laughing Apache woman became more than just a tale. It became a reminder that sometimes, fate hides in the smallest of moments, in laughter, in kindness, in the courage to see beyond differences. It became a story of love that crossed boundaries, of two souls who learned that hearts, no matter where they come from, speak the same language when they choose peace.